Hello and welcome back to Microeconomics with Professor Ludwinski. What we're going to be doing today is starting a new unit and talking about producers and the theory of the firm. This unit is going to have 7 different sections, so we're going to start off in this section introducing this topic, going over some of the assumptions. Then we'll talk about opportunity cost and production, think about different types of production and different types of cost, build up our knowledge around that. So we can take those costs and graphically analyze them through cost curves before we get into long-run adjustments, both on the market level and on the firm level. All of this is building up to thinking about perfect competition. And so when we talk about the assumptions today around that, a lot of them are going to have to do with what we're thinking about in terms of perfect competition. And what I want to hit home towards the end of this unit is how the assumptions that we are making tie into those results. I just don't want you to sort of blindly memorize the kind of findings, but I want you to understand how they flow from the things that we're assuming to be true about the market, and that way you can kind of think deeper about how things might be different if the assumptions don't hold. In our final video, we'll talk about producer surplus and conclude. So let's jump in here with the introduction. My goal for this section is to have you gain an understanding of the underpinnings of that supply function which we previously talked about. In particular, we're now looking at the firm side of the supply function, and when we're thinking about firm behavior, how they're responding to incentives, what those incentives are. We're building up models of production and looking at the cost structures of those firms. And we're not just going to stick to one firm because we're actually interested in looking at the market as a whole. I'm going to want to build a knowledge of the interplay between the individual firms, how those impact the market, and how in turn the market impacts and determines firm behavior as well. So capturing that interplay is going to be an important part of this unit. And then finally, one of the main goals for this chapter is for you to understand the longer run dynamics, and in particular thinking about entry and exit in different industries. So now let's discuss my learning objectives for this unit in terms of what I want you to be able to do after having gone through this. I want you to be able to state our 5 assumptions of perfect competition. I want you to relate opportunity costs to our supply curve and understand how those ideas connect. You should be able to construct a market supply curve from individual firms' supply curve. With cost functions, you should be able to determine the perfectly competitive firm, their profit maximizing output level, and what they would receive as a profit. And then with market changes, I want you to be able to know how they impact 7 key market and firm indicators. And also to differentiate between things that are in the short run and the long run. Finally, going back to those 5 assumptions, having gone through everything else, you should be able to now map those to the 4 main results of perfect competition and define and calculate producer surplus. So now let's discuss some more definitions here. First, what are we talking about when we're talking about a firm? We're going to talk a lot about a firm. What we mean is an organization that is producing any goods and service. So Walmart, FedEx, those are firms that you know, Microsoft, but also public utilities or things that run that, like waste management, even the Department of Defense or Cornell University. All of those could be considered firms. And the thing that binds these together is that they all engage in economic activity via markets, and they're forced with allocating scarce resources to make choices. Now, different firms and different organizations are going to have different goals. So in reality, they're going to have a lot of different motives. We can have firms that are trying to make the most profits that they can. They're maximizing profits. Other firms maybe are more about kind of growth and maximizing size and power. Nonprofit organizations have different various objectives. And governments, those can be analyzed as well, have objectives depending on whether we're thinking about politicians, how responsive they are to their constituency or particular bureaucrats. There's different ways to think about the organizational goals there as well. But what we're going to limit ourselves to talking about in this unit and in this course in general is firms that are trying to maximize our profits. That's going to be our focus, partially because most firms behave in that way, but also because it's just, to be honest, easier to analyze. We do have tools to analyze these other objectives. It's just a little more complicated and a little more difficult to put those down and talk those over. So we're going to be having this assumption of profit maximization, and we're going to define profit. It's just going to be total revenue minus total cost. Now we'll get into a little bit about definitions of cost and what are included and excluded, but I want to call out now that we're going to include both explicit and implicit cost when we're dealing with that cost function. So not just what are you paying out of pocket, but what are you giving up? You know, that idea that we introduced earlier in this course. And our model is going to include an owner and a manager, the business firm making those decisions, and the objective of the firm is to maximize the profit, right? That's the only objective. Now, they are going to do this with constraints, and in this unit, the constraint that we're going to deal with is perfectly competitive markets, and we'll talk about exactly what that is defined, but I want you to think about that as the constraint that they are maximizing their profits under. So when we're thinking about revenue, to dive into this profit equation, we'll be using the symbol pi, that n-looking thing up here, to denote profit. The total revenue, now this relationship to quantity depends on the nature of the competition in the particular market that we're thinking about. So we want to think about, okay, profit is going to be a function of what you're making and how much you're making. In particular, that's going to be the choice variable we're dealing with here. So let's think first about total revenue. How does that relate? Now, in more complicated market structures, your quantity is going to impact the price. And maybe you're selling different goods to different people at different prices. But if we only have one price, then our total revenue is simply going to be price times quantity. And in this unit, we're only going to be thinking about one price for all the goods that are being sold in that particular market. Total cost is going to depend on the firm's technology and production function, which is something we're going to talk about soon. Now, what we mean by production is simply the ability to take inputs and turn them into an output. That's what we mean by production. The other thing that's going to determine the total cost is the prices in factor markets. How much do those inputs cost? So those are the two things that are going to factor into our total cost. Now, both buyers and sellers are going to be acting under the cost-benefit principle. Buyers are going to say, should we buy one more unit? And they will act if their marginal benefit, which is their marginal utility, is at least as great as their marginal cost. Sellers are asking a similar question. Should we produce and sell one more unit? And they are looking to see if their marginal benefit, which is the extra revenue that they're getting from that extra sale, is at least as great as their marginal cost. And the cost of production is what we're meaning here. For both the buyer and the seller, opportunity cost is critical. Perhaps a buyer looking to buy a hamburger is thinking about, all right, if I eat this hamburger, I'm not eating pizza, right? So it's not just the fact that they're paying money, but it's what are they giving up to do that. We'll look at an example where a seller can do two things with their time. They can recycle aluminum or wash dishes. And so that idea of opportunity cost is going to be critical for understanding the seller's cost and what's going on in their unit, in this unit. Now, a big thing we're talking about in this unit is perfect competition. And so I'm going to define it by talking about the 4 assumptions that we make with perfect competition. The first one we already talked about. It's that the firm's goal is to maximize profit. And we already have talked about consumers. They're still maximizing their welfare. The second assumption is that there are a whole bunch of buyers and sellers in this market. So every seller has a very small market share that's going to come into play when we think about can they, and one seller, impact the price in the market. And because of this assumption, it's going to turn out to be no, because there's so many buyers, consumers have other options, and so they don't have the ability to individually impact price in this market. Because our assumption 3 is that all products are the same. We have standardized products. There's no kind of brand loyalty. There's no product differentiation. Everyone is basically making the same thing. This is true in markets like wheat and oil, where kind of there's very little differentiation there in terms of where those things are coming from and at an individual producer level. The fourth assumption is that they are mobile resources. This means that firms can freely enter and leave, and that inputs are moving to their highest valued use. And then the final assumption is that we have full information, meaning that buyers know all of the prices, sellers know about the quality of their own goods, and opportunities elsewhere, right? So everything is known here. Information is not a challenge or a difficulty. So the next thing I want to cover and discuss is talking about what a production function is. I mentioned it briefly, but production functions, what they're going to be doing for us is showing the input requirements that are needed. What do you need to run your coffee shop? Well, you need coffee, you need cups, you need a place to sell things, you need a machine to make coffee. And what do you need for every level of production, right? If you're selling 500 cups of coffee, what do you need if you're selling 700, 1,000, 6,000? So a production function is mapping inputs to a level of output and telling us how much of each input we need at that level of output. So we can summarize these production functions mathematically, which we will be doing. We can look at them in table form, which we'll do as well. But most often in this chapter, we'll look at kind of a graphical summation of our production functions and even summarize those a step further in looking at the underlying cost functions in that production. So having gone through this brief introduction, I just kind of want to restate what some of the things we're doing in this chapter. What I want you to be able to do is we're going to take a production function and a consumer's willingness to pay. So we're getting down to this low level of defining things in this reduced view. And then having this kind of very reduced view, we're going to be able to speak to kind of high level things. We're going to talk to how many firms we expect there to be in the market. We're going to speak to how much the market would supply, both in terms of the market and the firm quantity. We're going to be able to speak to the equilibrium price and the marginal revenue that the firms are receiving, and how much each firm is making and for what cost on the margin and what cost on average. So that is where we're going to go, is that ability to take these kind of really reduced small things and build them into something larger that we're speaking to and about in these dynamics. And so that is our introduction and some of the assumptions around perfect competition. In our next video, we'll talk about opportunity cost and get into the ins and outs of production. Thank you for joining, and I hope that you email me if you have questions, and I hope you keep watching these videos. Take care.